All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stephanie Kales with the North Carolina Council on Economic Education, and I'm here with my colleague Tori Yauk. And we're also here with Jared Korver, who is a member of the North Carolina Association of CPAs and also works as a wealth advisor at Beacon Wealth Care. And Jared's just going to answer some of the questions that we have about personal finance and financial planning. So thanks for being with us, Jared.
Yeah, thank you. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So let's dive right in. So the first question that I have for you is, what types of insurances do you think are necessary for a typical household to have?
Sure. Yeah. So I think, there's two that are legally required if you own a home and have a car, which is homeowners insurance and car insurance. Certainly if you rent, there's probably a case to be made for renters insurance, and in some places that is even required as well. Then the third that I would say would be a must is if you have anybody that depends on you in general, but also specifically for your ability to earn money, then the third would be life insurance. And for 99+% of the population, the form of life insurance that makes the most sense is what's called term life insurance, which means you purchase life insurance for a specific period of time, maybe to a certain age, or it may be just 20 or 30 years or 10 years, whatever the case may be. Mm-hmm. You pay for that insurance over that time, and once that time is up, you don't have insurance anymore, but hopefully at that point you don't need it. So usually once people get to a point where they're retired and they don't really have dependents anymore, there's not usually a great need for life insurance. So term life insurance is the simplest, by far the cheapest, and easiest to understand of the life insurances. The fourth, and this would be if there's, life insurance would be everyone needs it if you have a dependent. The fourth one is, it kind of depends, but would be long-term disability insurance. So, life insurance comes to mind as something pretty readily. Like we can imagine, God forbid, something happening to us in a car accident or whatever. It's easier to imagine that scenario than it is to imagine a scenario where we have some sort of injury or some sort of health ailment, cancer, or something that does not mean we're no longer here, but does mean we can't work, and probably also means we have medical bills to pay on top of not being able to work. So long-term disability insurance is a way to sort of pass on that risk to an insurance company, obviously pay for that privilege to do that. So that's long-term disability is a lot more complex than life insurance because it's much harder for insurance companies to underwrite the risk of someone getting injured than it is someone to die. If I'm 32, the actuarial tables that they use for me for life insurance are much easier and more robust than it would be for disability, just because it's a much smaller likelihood that I would die at 32 than become disabled. So anyways, that's a lot, but definitely homeowners / renters insurance and car insurance. And then depending on whether you start stacking on people who depend on you, then life insurance and then disability insurance.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. And so in regards to a financial plan, why are these different types of insurance critical to a good financial plan?
Yeah, great question. Some of that I got into a little bit. Essentially, what the number one thing when you start thinking about finances is to do what's necessary if possible. And granted, some people, this is just not possible, which is a terrible, unfortunate reality. But if you can, the number one thing to guard against is catastrophe. Okay. And insurance is a very key way of keeping us more than a hair's breadth away from catastrophes. So the point of the insurance is not to build wealth. It's not to act as an investment. It's not to do anything other than to try and distance yourself from the worst case scenario. And it's really difficult to do that without insurance, especially when you're younger. And I mean, I guess I even missed the big fifth one, which is health insurance. Again, I'm showing my privilege here. If, again, not everybody has the means or necessarily access to a great health plan, but that's really important. Okay. And so depending on your age and health, I really like high deductible health plans because they enable you to contribute to what's called a health savings account, or HSA. And those are one of the most magical things you can ever contribute to. Again, it assumes you have enough disposable income to both, cover deductible in a year and make additional contributions. But those are really great. Health insurance is just a whole quagmire, but obviously that's very important to the extent that you can get access to any level of coverage. Even if you feel like, hey, I don't have dependents, I don't have, like, that's probably, even before life insurance and all the other stuff, extremely important.
Absolutely. Thank you. I really like how you framed it as just like sort of a buffer between you and your potential worst case scenario. I think
that's right.
A great way to sum up insurance and the importance of it.
Definitely. All right. So my next question is shifting gears a little bit away from insurance. But can you talk a little bit about risk and return and the trade-off that has when it relates to making bigger choices, like, let's say, buying a car, or, going back to college to get my master's degree, or things that are going to impact my overall financial picture?
Sure. So, risk and return are really, in an ideal world, two sides of the same coin, meaning in order to earn anything, whether it's, returns in the stock market, whether it's the knowledge and maybe potentially, higher earning power or better job security of an advanced degree, or even purchasing a car that might be more reliable or longer lasting or safer, whatever the case may be. All of those, in order to achieve them, you have to take some measure of risk. This is true even with just, if I want to get in shape physically, I have to go out and risk being uncomfortable, maybe getting injured while I'm running, whatever. It's true of anything in life. It's especially true of finances. So, you mentioned the idea of making a decision to, let's say, go back to school for a master's degree. That's a hard calculus to explicitly say, well, here's the return and here's the risk. But I think it's just wise to think through what's the end goal here, and what's the risk I take in that scenario. Let's say you take on additional student debt, or you might have cash to pay for some of it, if not all of it, and there's an opportunity cost to spending it on your education versus, paying down a mortgage or saving. Those kinds of conversations are very quickly become less about math and more about your priorities and values as a person, and those of the people who, you are closest to in life. So if you're single and you want to go get an advanced degree, then it becomes a math problem. You just say, well, can I afford to pay for it or finance it? And do I want to do it? The more people you introduce into your life, the more complicated the situation gets. And then it's just, hey, what am I really good at? What do I want to get better at? What am I passionate about? And you have to then sort of back into, well, what does that mean for the way I think about money? And how much, does that additional degree outweigh another priority that I have? I might, if I really want to retire at age 60, does going back for an advanced degree and taking on debt and maybe, reducing income for a little while, does that help me get there? If not, am I okay with that because I want the, additional learning and opportunities? So that, that unfortunately, those are very vague discussions, but important ones. Those are really money feels like it's primarily math based and numbers based, but it can really easily go beyond that. A car is probably easier. Car is probably more, I grew up in a blue collar family where, a new car for us was 10 years old. That was just the reality. It's all I knew.
Yeah.
And, we had, we never got stranded on the side of the road. We probably got lucky, and my parents just tried to find cars that were in fairly good shape, yada, yada, yada. Well, in the year 2020, you can find a car that will stop itself. You can find a car that will it will park itself. You can find a car that will basically drive itself. And so that's a harder question in this day and age, because it can easily get into, well, don't I want to do what's safest for my family? And all of a sudden you find yourself in a $50,000 car, or,
Right.
30 or whatever. And so that's a harder one, especially because our culture values, showing off your cars for some strange reason. And so, like, the car thing, I think I am still a big fan of buying used cars, and if you can, pay cash. Again, not everybody can do that. Okay.
Yeah.
But assuming you can find a car, I personally tend towards Japanese models of Hondas and Toyotas, because I think they last a long time. Mine have. And if you do that, it's not maybe as fun. You're not getting all the brand new features that, it maybe makes you feel less safe. But you also keep from taking a bath on depreciation of a brand new car. Leasing is not a great idea for most people. And financing a car is okay. I think over time, it's best not to build that habit into your life if you can. I would rather save and, spend $7,000 to $10,000 on a car that's 7 to 10 years old, and just not get used to paying a car payment each month, if that was possible. Now, again, it all goes back to these priorities, but I would personally rather spend money on something other than a car. And so that's kind of my 2 bits there. Again, though, there's a risk there. My 2010 Honda Fit has 170,000 miles, and there's a risk that it could conk out on I-40 one day.
Yeah.
I don't expect that to happen, but the likelihood of it happening for that car is probably marginally higher than it would be for a car that was 10 years newer. I'm okay with that risk. So that's the internal decision that you have to make, is what risk am I okay taking, and if I am, what's the return? Well, for me, the return is I paid very little for that car, and it doesn't cost me anything going forward. So
Yeah.
Absolutely.
sorry,
And
that's a soapbox for me.
I'm
As you
all
can tell.
I'm all about a used car. I have
Yeah.
loved every used car. I've never, I don't think I will ever own a new car, but
Yeah. I do love what you're saying too, that I feel like risk and return often just gets talked about in the sense of like the math and the hard numbers. So
Sure.
I love the idea that like really every decision you're making has
Right.
risk and has return, and a lot of that's about priorities.
That's right.
Absolutely. And so my next question, again, we're going right from, this is probably something that might even have more social stake than a risk and reward equation. And that is how much I should be saving.
Yeah.
So, I know that there's like percentages that vary by age, by lifestyle, by number of dependents and all that stuff. But sort of like, what would be your recommendation for how much people should be saving?
Yeah. So the rules of thumb that get used a lot in answering this question typically hover around 12 to 15%. Okay. The problem with rules of thumb is that they can be wildly inaccurate in individual cases. And so an example of that would be, well, and I'll tell you why. Part of the reason why that you can't just say, well, everybody needs to save X amount is for some of the things I've said already. Depending on your earnings, your Social Security income when you retire will be different. And there's a cap on how much of your income is taxed by Social Security, and therefore that you pay into your future benefit.
Yeah.
So let's say you are a high earner and you make $200,000 a year. Now, I unfortunately am talking to a bunch of teachers, and I know that is not something we've prioritized in society. And so maybe this is an unfortunate reality. That being said, if that person earns $200,000 and they're spending a good bit of that, their Social Security benefit is maxing out at this year, I think it's like $130,000. Anything they earned above that is not taxed for Social Security purposes. So less of their income is getting replaced by Social Security when they retire.
Right.
They also are probably used to living a lifestyle that's expensive. Most people who earn that much money have a hard time not spending a lot of it. That's true for any of us, but in terms of pure dollar amounts, the higher your earnings go, the more used to nice things you get, and the harder it is to let go of those nice things when you stop working. So the higher, this is kind of the insidious thing about all this, the higher your income, the higher the relative amount of savings you need to do. Because again, Social Security is going to replace less of it. Your lifestyle is going to creep up with your income naturally. And so you've got to work harder to save enough to keep your lifestyle sort of constant as you go into retirement. On the other hand, if you are not worried about like having a bunch of extra money like coming into your paycheck each month, it's a problem most people don't have. You still need to save. I'm not going to say you don't need to save, but the answer is I would feel way more comfortable telling someone start at somewhere like 8 to 10% if you can swing it. And then in order to keep, lifestyle creep from happening, and I can talk more about that in a second, what I would typically say is, as your income goes up and you have, again, the priority of being able to retire at some point, to essentially split your raises in half and spend half your raise and then save the other half. Otherwise, what's going to happen is this lifestyle creep means if you're saving 10% when you start and your income keeps going up even marginally, well, again, the higher your income goes, really the higher your savings rate needs to go as well. So I would say if you can shoot, and again, the teachers also, there's the realities of the North Carolina state pension. So the North Carolina pension is in good shape, which is definitely not true of our neighbors to the south and many other states in the country. Ours is in good shape, which is great. So there's sort of some forced saving going on there where you don't have a choice what's going into the pension. But I would say to think about your saving is coming from all those different places. So the pension, but also what you may put into the 403B plan or just into, Roth IRAs. If you can shoot for 10%, and maybe you can't do that when you start, but do what you can and start as early as possible. And then just commit to over time increasing it. You might even say increase it 1% until you just can't, you're kind of tapped out.
Yeah.
That's what I would say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I know you touched a lot on my next question, but anything else that you want to offer? So I definitely am taking away from this that saving something should be a line item on my financial plan. But, I guess when you talk about taking that first step, how do you recommend someone do that? Like, I guess like that first run that you go on in 2021 or whatever it is, how do you, I guess like what's your elevator pitch for them to start that process?
So, I mean, the way I think about money is, the basic principles are sort of these, spend less than you make, and keep the difference between what you make and what you spend, as sizable as you can within reason. Okay. The reason, at first, that's important because you can build up an emergency fund. Earlier we talked about insurance. Well, sometimes there are things that happen that insurance doesn't cover neatly, whether it's a health issue or a car accident or whatever. So you have some cash and set aside, let's say 3 to 6 months. That's the first goal of anybody in any situation. Set aside some money for an emergency. Then if you keep doing that, you keep living a lifestyle that's well within your means. Then you start thinking, well, how can I do this after I am no longer working for a paycheck? And so that means you start hopefully saving above and beyond an emergency fund. And typically, a really good way to save is to save and invest in the stock market. And thankfully, it's really a lot easier to do that now than it ever has been. And it's almost free. And the best kind of broad-based passive index funds, which is just a way of saying, instead of me buying and selling individual stocks, I just want to own sort of the whole pie and do it really cheaply. You can start doing that. And, depending on where you work, you might have a 401k. And if you have a 401k or a 403b, which is the same thing, it just means you work at a state institution or a nonprofit institution. If you get an employer match, then do whatever you need to do to contribute enough to take full advantage of that match. So let's say an employer matches 4%. I mean, do whatever you have to do to contribute at least 4% to that 401k, because it's literally free money that if you don't, it's just wasted. If you don't have access to a 401k, for most people just starting out, a Roth IRA is a great place to save. It allows you to contribute up to $6,000 in a year. It's after tax, which means you've paid tax on the money and then you put it into this account. But then in retirement, when you take it out, it's not taxed. So Roth IRAs, you have to leave the money in there until you're 59 and a half at least. Otherwise, there's steep penalties to access it, but that's a good thing because you want to just leave it alone. You want to let the stock market do its thing and hopefully grow. And the reason that we have to invest rather than just keeping money in a savings account is over time, the dollar loses value, and that's called inflation. And if we just keep it, sitting in a savings account or under a mattress, over time, then we're having to work a lot harder and save a way money in order to work for us in the future. So yeah, build an emergency fund. Make sure you got the insurance in place. If you've got an employer plan that has a match, take full advantage of it. And then again, once you started, then the goal is, hey, how can I get up to, let's say 10%? How can I make sure I'm not allowing my lifestyle to outpace my ability to save for the future? And honestly, here's what I would say. This is kind of my personal soapbox. I think you should give some money away. And I think this is really interesting. The more money you give away, the easier it is to save for retirement for two reasons. One, you get used to spending less while you're working. By definition, if you give it away, you can't spend it. And so you kind of keep that insidious lifestyle creep from making you save harder. But two, if you are someone who cultivates that spirit of generosity, then it's easier to also make the decision then to save. They're different decisions, but they're both based on empathy. One is empathy toward other people, and one is empathy towards your future self. And so, everyone has different ideas about giving, but I think giving is a really powerful financial tool for a lot of reasons, notwithstanding just, I think the positive, change that it can create in our world is paramount. So yeah, that's more than you asked for, but.
No,
it was great though.
Thank you.
Yeah, good information for sure. Well, that's all the questions that we had for you. So thank you again for your time and for being with us. And I think this is going to be really, really helpful for the teachers.
Awesome. Good. Well, please let me know if there's anything else I can do.
Thanks.
Absolutely.